নমস্কার। এখনো হয়তো কেউ আসেননি। একজন দুজন চলে এলেই আমরা শুরু করব। এসেছেন, দুজনকে আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি। নমস্কার, আমি রোহিণী, জ্যোতিরিন্দ্র মৈত্র মেমোরিয়াল ট্রাস্টের পক্ষ থেকে সকলকে স্বাগত জানাই। আজ জ্যোতিরিন্দ্র মৈত্র মেমোরিয়াল লেকচারের নবম অধিবেশন। এই স্মারক বক্তৃতাটি আমরা গত বেশ কিছু বছর ধরে করছি মেমোরিয়াল ট্রাস্টের পক্ষ থেকে। কিন্তু এবছরটি একটু অন্যরকম। এবছর বিশ্বব্যাপী অতিমারির প্রেক্ষাপটে এই লেকচারটি ভার্চুয়াল প্ল্যাটফর্মে নিয়ে এলাম আমরা। তাতে একটা সুবিধে হলো যে যারা কলকাতায় থাকেন না বলে এতদিন এই লেকচার শুনতে পারেননি, তারা পৃথিবীর যে কোনো কোনায় বসে, নিজের বাড়িতে বসে এই লেকচারটি শুনতে পারবেন। আজকের আমাদের বক্তা শ্রীরন্তী দেব মৈত্র, তার বক্তৃতাটি ইংরেজি ভাষায়, তাই বাকি অনুষ্ঠানটি আমি ইংরেজিতেই সঞ্চালনা করব। On behalf of Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Trust, I welcome all to the 9th annual Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture. It is my privilege to address a global audience this year, as we have gone virtual due to the ongoing pandemic situation. For those who are not initiated to Jyotirindra Moitra's life and work and are attending this lecture for the first time, Jyotirindra Moitra was a poet, composer, Tagore exponent, a founder member of the Indian People's Theatre Association, which is better known as the IPTA, and a pioneer in creating Ganasangit, or the people's song. The Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture was first organized in the year 2012 to mark the end of the birth centenary celebrations of the poet in Kolkata. Since then, stalwarts from different fields have delivered this lecture. We have had the honor and privilege of hosting eminent personalities like Shri Shomik Bandyopadhyay, Professor Omiyo Bagchi, Dr. Martin Kempshen, Professor Uma Dasgupta, Sri Soumitra Chattopadhyay, Sri Abhijit Bandyopadhyay, Srimati Usha Ganguly, and Professor Shopon Chakraborty. This year, the memorial lecture will be delivered by Shriranthy Dev Moitra. Before I introduce today's respected speaker, I would request Srimati Shushmita Rai Chaudhary, President of the Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Trust, to say a few words.
Namaskar. Welcome to the 9th Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture. This also happens to be the first virtually delivered one, as we did not want to disappoint our esteemed audience who have encouraged us to hold this lecture for the past decade. We also did not want to lose out on the advantage of gaining a worldwide viewership in these most difficult times. As we are all painfully aware, the year 2020 has rolled out in front of us rather like a horror film. The sudden onset of the dreaded pandemic has turned this year into one of bereavements, anxiety, tension, and psychological trauma. We have lost the known and the unknown, the renowned and the not so renowned, with a regularity that is scary. It is unsure how many more lives are poised to be lost. With utmost grief, I mention the loss of two of our most respected and beloved speakers in the course of this year. On April 23rd, we had the shock of losing Srimati Usha Ganguly, the legendary theatre personality who had delivered an impassioned Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture in 2018. Most recently, on November 15th, we lost Sri Soumitra Chattopadhyay after all our prayers and hopes proved futile. We had enjoyed a mesmerizing evening when he delivered this memorial lecture in 2016. I humbly dedicate this evening's session to Srimati Usha Ganguly and Sri Soumitra Chattopadhyay. I also convey my regards to the other esteemed speakers on behalf of the Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Trust and my own self. May I now request Rohini to introduce today's speaker, Sri Jyotirindra Moitra, a renowned collector, archivist, and a passionate researcher of Indian traditional music. He also happens to be a very dear nephew of Jyotirindra Moitra, my father, who most indulgently admired his love for music. Over to Rohini now, please.
Jyotirindra Moitra, a renowned musicologist and a connoisseur of North Indian classical music. He hails from a family well known for its passion for and knowledge of music and literature. He has an enormous collection of very rare gramophone discs from its earliest era. He is a reference point for serious music scholars and has delivered lectures on music at various national and international platforms. The title of his lecture today is Colonial Encounters with Indian Traditional Music. The speaker welcomes audience responses and questions, which you can put forward in the comments section. The speaker would be happy to address them at the end of the lecture. I would now request today's speaker, Sri Jyotirindra Moitra, to deliver the 9th annual Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture.
To give a memorial talk on Jyotirindra Moitra set me thinking on my credentials to be on this platform. But then I thought that I should remember the man who was my Sejo Jatamoshai and who condescended to become my friend. Gurujans during our time normally kept a distance, but he was an exception. This memory gave me the courage to say yes, and I thank Shushmita, Devashish, and Rohini doing what they are doing about keeping alive Jyotirindra Moitra by forming a trust, recreating his creations, and so many other activities. Coming back to my friendship with Sejo Jatamoshai, it started with the game of cricket, which was my almost only occupation in childhood. He reached out to me with amazing anecdotes of the legends of the game and subsequently introduced me to a very rich cricket literature. particularly writings of Neville Cardus. I especially remember his deep reverence for a great Australian leg spinner, Clary Grimmett, who played his cricket in 1920s. He repeatedly told me that Grimmett was as great a bowler as Bradman as a batsman. He said he tried to emulate his bowling action just by reading accounts of him. Uh, I came to know subsequently that he was an all round sportsman, having played hockey, cricket, and badminton for his college. I faced his bowling when very young and found his leg spins very difficult to read, and so were his drop shots in badminton. I confess I didn't have any idea about his greatness in his creative fields, which gradually became, I came to know, much later, when sometimes he opened up on his theory about folk and ragas and raginis having origins in various bird songs and their whistlings, or his grand design of composing an opera much larger in scope than his famous Navajiboner Gan. Those who have witnessed the spectacle of Ramlila produced by Bharatiya Kala Kendra can never forget the pan-Indian musical landscape he painted in so many voice tones and colors, and it is our misfortune that no recording of this masterpiece is available today. I am reminding myself to come back to the brief of today's agenda, and I will seek to project a musical landscape in and around the colonial era spanning more than 200 years. My credentials, apart from being a glorified clerk, is a passion for listening to traditional music in particular. Today's submission is a result of a question I kept asking myself, that why there are so many differences in the emotive content and variety in respect of vocal music in particular between the early recordings of the Tawais and Ustads and what we are offered today. Could this be attributed to colonial encounters with our traditional music and musicians? Let me now present my answer paper. So to the answer paper, just a moment. Yeah. Encounters with traditional Indian music began almost simultaneously with the first European visitors to Indian soil. But the early encounters were accidental, not out of any search, like that of Marco Polo, who, describing Devdashi dancers or dances, wrote that the dancers were all but naked, dancing before the god till he consumes his food. That was in 1290, 1290 AD, and the place was Coromandel Coast. There had been numerous other stray or commissioned encounters from 17th century onwards by the Dutch, Portuguese, French, and British. But I will principally restrict my search to the Britishers whose design for setting up a colony was taking a concrete shape by the end of the 18th century and which resulted ultimately in the Crown taking over in 1858. Before I come to the first serious attempt by the Britishers to explore Indian music, principally through the good offices of Sir William Jones, who set up the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784, I'll refer to a very interesting work. This is titled Hindu Manners, Customs and Ceremonies by Abbe J. A. Dubois. He was a Frenchman residing in Madras during the last part of 18th century. The preface of this book was penned by Max Muller, and this book presumably was very popular in England at that point of time, during that time rather. His observations on Indian music deserves our attention. He wrote, Hindus enjoy listening to music, which is no farther advanced now than 2 to 3,000 years ago. There are no harmonies and tunes are dull, plenty of noise, shrill piercing sounds, and discordant notes. He found vocal music monotonous and wind instruments played mostly by low caste barbers and pariahs absolutely uninspiring. And interestingly, he said that most of the wind instruments were, saliva stained. This was one of his observations. He, however, had some kind words on lute or veena, which he found more pleasing, and observed that it was reserved for the rich and higher caste. He also made a comparison with harp of the Jews, King David in particular, who played it to please his master Saul. His further observations on temple dancing girls and courtesans attached to each temple is important for social anthropologists also. He found that each temple had 8 to 12 or more courtesans attached to them, and they were ranked second only to the priests. They dance and sing twice also at public ceremonies, and their dancing were lascivious and gestures indecorous. Their singing were mostly confined to obscene verses describing some licentious episode in the history of their gods. Their gods means our gods. I presume it must be a reference to our Joydev's Git Govinda, which was and is still very popular in South. On the social front, he said that these courtesans accompanied gentlemen visiting another gentleman and were invited to marriage and family meetings, and it was no shame for parents to give their daughters to this profession. Interestingly, they were the only women in India who enjoyed the privilege to read, dance, and to sing. A well bred woman will blush to acquire these attainments. Being a clergyman, he cautioned us about their snares, like sirens, which trapped Ulysses, and their quiet seduction had so much skill, he was at a loss to find that where he could see such skills in Europe. Alas, they were strangely most decently clothed in India, most decently clothed women in India, and they didn't expose any part of their body. Now, coming to some of the British observations, the early British settlers, mostly traders, soldiers, or adventurers, also wrote on some stray encounters with musicians and dancers. And by the late 17th century, Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay became fairly large settlements, and those exposures became more frequent. In the meantime, James Todd, who was chronicling the history of Rajasthan, also heard Dhrupad by Marathi singers, marked by rapid utterances and total dissonance. And Toppa he also heard in Rajput courts, which he attributed to associations with opium. We find that Warren Hastings in 1780s expressed great interest to Indian culture and also to some Hindustani tunes which were called Hindustani airs by the Anglo-Indian Society. During Hastings' visit to Oudh in 1784, he was captivated by some performances organized by one Margaret Fouquet, who apparently collected many such tunes from her exposures to some musicians in Oudh. It was said that Warren Hastings took so much interest in such tunes that he endeavored to sing some of them and made it known that he liked to sing them, although it was reported that he had a hollow voice. On a lighter side, I might add that the ghost anecdote mongers reported that his whistling and singing Indian songs were heard by many in some of the staircases, in one of the staircases, not some, in one of the staircases in the offices of the Director General of Commercial Intelligence in Dalhousie Square, now BBD Bagh, and less frequently in the corridors of National Library in Alipur. Now, coming back to the main topic, we have reports of an extraordinary musical event on the 5th November 1795 when a cellist, Mr. Lebedev, presented his new play, The Disguise, which commenced with an ensemble of Western and Indian instruments and set to music the words of the famous and much admired poet Bharat Chandra Rai. This is interesting because I suppose that was the first attempt to bring Western and Indian music together. It was to the credit of Warren Hastings that he assembled a group of Orientalists and scholars like William Jones, Wilkins, Colebrooke, Halhed. An Asiatic Society of Bengal was formed in 1784. In quick succession came translations of Bhagavad Gita, Hitobodesh by Wilkins, Shakuntala, and Geet Govindo by Sir William Jones. But the most serious inquiry about Indian traditional music was made by Sir William Jones in 1784 in his book on the musical modes of the Hindus. He took help of local pundits to know more about the antiquity of Indian music, and some help from Sophia Plowden and Margaret Fouquet, two very young, active lady collectors of Indian songs. However, at best, their efforts were termed amateur at the best. The book was totally devoid of the then current practices and clearly not guided by ustads, whom he found mostly illiterate. Some other articles also came up in Oriental studies, but they were of very little consequence. One important factor, of course, which Sir William Jones did at that point of time was engaging uh, Mr. Solvins, who was a very, very famous painter from Antwerp, and he commissioned this Francois Balthazar Solvins to do 250 color etchings and 35 etchings of Indian instruments. In fact, Mr. Solvins himself had something to say on Indian music, particularly about the veena, which he found distasteful. We had to wait another 50 years to find another serious attempt made on the subject of Indian music. That is by N. Augustus Willard, who came up with a study in print on 1834 titled A Treatise on the Music of India. He was fond of classical literature and was employed in the courts of the Nawab of Banda. He was generally appreciative of the antiquity of Indian music, but he claimed that musicians were illiterate, licentious, and abominable. He proclaimed melody as nudity in front of harmony and was at loss to appreciate the merits of a Persian ghazal proclaiming love for man with another man, and Hindustani songs glorifying pangs of separation from absent lovers and women in, uh, in spite of their being married, offering their love to Krishna. Obviously, he hadn't tasted Rumi's poetry, the use of wine as a metaphor to love and separation, nor was he really aware of the Sringar Ras, which was principal and which is still principal to almost all classical compositions. He blamed the conquest of Hindustan by Mohammedans to be the chief reason of decline in Indian music, something which I thought today's politicians very often do. But at least it was an effort, though clearly without the aid of any expert musician. In defense of this general attitude, I can narrate some earlier encounters with musicians, a class which the Britishers distrusted from the very beginning. The first British traveller to India, Robert Covet, travelling overland on the first day of April 1610, narrated that he saw 10 or 12 fiddlers playing fiddles and approaching him in a very friendly manner. But they turned out to be devils, thieves with other very evil intentions. Another 17th century Venetian traveller, Niccolao Manucci, observed that these Indian musician fiddlers always accompanied armies and, drunk with opium, sang lute songs and sometimes sacrificed their lives by charging wildly in the middle of a formation. The noted author and anthropologist Richard Burton, writing in 1851, provided some sort of answer to this practice, that it was a custom of the Rajput musicians to accompany the head of a clan, praising bravery, etc., etc. Whatever it may be, it is quite clear that these foreigners never had the opportunity to come across genuine learned musicians or great tawifs, and one Mrs. Kindersley wrote in 1754 that when a black man has a mind to compliment a European, he treats him to a nautch. Nautch means dancing girls. It was indeed seen in many festivities hosted by the local rich in Lucknow or Kolkata that the Britishers were treated to these nautch girls with an emphasis on their lascivious dancing ability. Although there were reports also of Raja Ram Mohan Roy hosting the great Catalan of the East, Nicky Bai, to regale the audience with great music. About all these efforts made by the Britishers, a noted scholar said that these British forays into Indian cultures were largely catalogic, classificatory, and enumerative. Did the English colonial intellectuals compose in Indian languages for expressive and not pragmatic purposes? How many of them inhabited the landscape of local languages and wrote literature? Mughals did quite frequently. Our next encounter will be after 70 odd years, and Anand Kumarswamy, the noted scholar and Indologist, wrote some important chapters on the state of Indian music during that period. I'll try to give some gist of his thoughts on the subject. Writing in 1908, he was scathing in his criticism about the state of affairs of Indian music. I'll quote: "A heavier blow has been struck than Aurangzeb's. Indian music, like the other expressions of Indian culture, has gone down, for a time or forever, before the material ideals of Western civilization. Successful mechanization has so hypnotized the East that it is blind to its own slavery." He cited several reasons for this. One, shift of gravity of patronization from the aristocratic and the temple to urban middle class, which is cut off from its cultural roots, together with the snobbery of anglicized Indians and stupidity of educationists. The second point he made was that music has always been the delight of kings despite luxuries and corruption. They were centers of culture, the place of royal craftsmen, pundits, astrologers, and musicians were assured. British governance changed all that. Musicians were dispersed, gramophones and French tutors have taken their place, and the progressive India of the educated professional classes are extraordinarily material in their needs and narrow in outlook. He made several other points critical of the British intrusion, including huge imports of Western instruments and harmoniums at the expense of promoting local instruments. Uh, According to me, the most topical observation he made was that the Western culture may be and will be of value to the East, but it must be a postgraduate course. It will not stand in the place of mother's milk. His views will be echoed by a few, but not many. Another musicologist from England, A. H. Fox Strangways, toured India for 6 months during 1910-1911 to learn the languages of Indian music. Like Kumaraswamy, he was very apprehensive of diminishing royal patronage, introduction of harmonium and gramophone records which hurt the pride of profession. He recognized that Indian music was a living language, as opposed to medieval Europe or ancient Greek, and thought Rabindranath personified Indian music, and his melodies were such that it would be pleasing even to Plato. He met some notable musicians like Veena Session in Mysore and Surendranath Bandyopadhyay of Vishnupur, whose Surbahar, according to him, sounded more mysterious than sitar. On singers, he made a very interesting observation that European singers were apt to be voice producers first and musicians afterwards, versus Indian singer is before all a musician who may happen to have a good voice but seldom a good one. We now come to the topic touched both by Kumaraswamy and Fox Strangways, that is, gramophone and gramophone records, although they were not very complimentary on the introduction in India. During the beginning of the 20th century, that is, during the first commercial manufacture and marketing of gramophone records in Europe, which was in 1902, India, with a population of over 300 million, was considered a very lucrative market. Looking at the huge commercial prospects, two Britishers arrived in India in November 1902 to do the first native recordings. The two Europeans, Geisberg, and Jod Dilnut were completely ignorant of the complexities of Indian music and merits of the artists and lacked any appreciation of the cultural life of India. In fact, Geisberg preferred Burmese drama to Indian music. They engaged the services of Amarendra Dotto and Jamshedji Ramji Madan, two noted uh, theatre personalities of that time, to collect and select artists for recording, and initially recorded two little Notch girls aged 14 to 16 years old. They, according to them, had miserable voices. Then they recorded Gaharjan and other artists of classical theatre and one classical male vocalist by the name of Elsie Boral, whose voice they found nasal and effeminate. During their next visit in 1904, they probed further to record the Darbar musicians, but because the local H-Bose and Pathé companies, also in business by that time, and some other German companies were all vying for the best talents in India, they found the competition stiff. While there were uh, several indigenous and non-British companies vying for the Indian market in 1905-1906, the Swadeshi movement gave the Britishers a tool to attack other companies by destroying their stocks in some cases or taking umbrage under the censorship imposed on Swadeshi products and Swadeshi songs which were recorded. This was actually Lord Curzon's doing. That is what we learn from history. It is also true that if the political situation in India or in Bengal were different in 1905 and beyond, with the valiant efforts of Amarendra Dotto, Hemendra Mohan Bose, and Jogindranath Mukherjee, who attempted to set up an independent indigenous sound recording industry in India, a very different narrative could have emerged of the entire recording history of India. Of course, we are grateful to the British company to provide us reference points for so many great masters and their performances. But it is also true that they did what they did for commercial purposes only. We are thus deprived of full-scale recordings of classical numbers which were restricted to 3.5 minutes at the most. That some of these records still enthrall us are due to the genius of the artists and not the choice and acumen of the recording company. Give me just a moment. I think some sound is coming. মঙ্গলা ওখানে আওয়াজ আসছে ভীষণ just a moment. Mr. Kumaraswamy and Fox Strangways must have noticed this factor when they commented negatively on gramophone and gramophone records, since they were fully acquainted with the type of records which came out in Europe, where the full symphony orchestras were recorded, whereas in our case, we only get truncated portion of classical pieces. It's my view. That is why they criticized. I will now draw attention to another issue touched upon by both Kumaraswamy and Fox Strangways, that is, the diminishing influence and strength of Indian darbars. During the early part of 20th century, India had more than 500 princely states, occupying one-third of India's total area, and contributing one-fourth of the total Indian population. Some of these darbars were of medieval lineage, and some were for the convenience of the British to keep the local population quiet. British residents were suzerain to most of the darbars, and one letter by Lord Reading to Nizam, written in 1916, says it all. No ruler of an Indian state can justifiably claim to negotiate with the British government on an equal footing. The Britishers encouraged the kings and princes to be educated at Oxford, Eton, settle down in exotic locations like Nice, have European wives, Rolls-Royce, cine cameras, to build new palaces in inaccessible places, to cut them off from the people, and with ballrooms in place of darbars, billiard rooms, cricket pitches, they became caricatures of Oriental splendor. All traditional education, sponsorship of arts were cut down to accommodate other expenses. And some of the boarding schools in India became the Etons of the East. Europeans were totally unaware of the immense strength of musicians and other artists in the 18th century darbars. Some of the courts, like, for example, Rajputana and Oudh. I'll just give one example of Jaipur during the time of Ram Singh II, that is 1844-45, boasted of a Gunijan Khana of 58 kalabans, 44 women singers, 4 Kathak dancers, plus scholars, poets, and painters sharing their skill and creativity. It was just one example. Lord Curzon, discussing Indian princes in Jaipur in 1902, said, I quote, they keep alive their traditions and customs, they provide scope for the activities of the hereditary aristocracy of the country, and employment for native intellect and ambition, and loss of which, if ever they be allowed to disappear, Indian society will go to pieces like a dismantled vessel in a storm. His prophetic vision, alas, was not shared by others in the past nor in future, and the backbone of interdisciplinary approach to our fine arts were gone forever. I'll just give one example that the synthesis of art, music, and literature, as in Ragmala paintings, were possible only due to this glittering presence of creative artists in the darbars. Also, this heterogeneous body, I mean, is somewhere Muslims, somewhere Hindus, they helped to create a very strong religious bondage. A piece of information in this context may be of interest. During 1930s, a census revealed that Hyderabad, ruled by Nizam, boasted of 93% Hindus, and Kashmir, of almost the same size, had 90% Muslim population, although having a Rajput Raja as their king. Of course, a completely secular music based on the sameness of the rasa also helped to bind the population together. The loss of courtly patronage, however, had more serious repercussions on the musicians and music in general. I'm again giving my brief to Mr. Kumaraswamy, who wrote on the Darbar music the following. It is the chamber music of the aristocratic society where the patrons retains musicians for his own entertainment and for the pleasure of the circle of his friends, or it is temple music where the musician is a servant of the god. The public concert is unknown, and the livelihood of the artist does not depend upon his ability and will to amuse the crowd. Fame, then, was a relative concept and really reached beyond musicians and connoisseurs. Cut off from the sheltered darbar, a classical musician found himself face to face with uninformed listeners, more accustomed to popular film and other music. Music thus became a matter of public consumption and can be interpreted as a commodity, sold, purchased, and consumed. It was at this point, probably, gharanas as a separate set of groups emerged, forming musical cartels of close musical families and also to establish an exclusive product identity. These phenomena had far reaching effects on our traditional music, particularly on the hereditary and non hereditary musicians. This will require a very elaborate analysis, which strictly do not fall under today's topic. So I'll go to slightly, I'll deviate slightly in another direction. This shift of patronage gave us various consumer models for traditional music, such as buyers of long playing records and CDs, organizers which sponsor music events, business houses, and even the state, including All India Radio and many TV channels. I use the word consumer, meaning sponsors also. The good and bad implications of this consumerism are yet to emerge in full clarity. But the collapse of darbars have definitely changed the face of traditional music. Before I end, I'll re-examine two more aspects which came out of Western observers in this study. I had remarked on Captain Villiers' observation about love in the context of Indian music and his inability to understand Shringaras. This requires a small closer examination. A comparison of thungris, khyals, kirtans, kavalis, and dhamars always gave us a set of picture of secular erotic images in a sacred devotional plane. The images are erotic, but the plane is totally different, a devotional plane. It is indeed trans-religious, integrating two different religions, or even sects within sects. Islamic tradition is definitely not distinct from Hindu tradition in the context of performance of dhamar, kavali, thungri, or even khyal. Here, in the canvas, we have the performer carving out the aesthetics of emotion and desire and longing that leads to ecstasy. The performer is seen taking the erotic feminine identity, irrespective of whether it is a thungri or dhamar or a kavali. And even the most robust male singers must assume this role. This erotic feminine is the central rasa, Sringar, of dhamar, thungri, and kavali, or even kirtan, and in most cases, khayals also. In Qawwalis, the images from Arab lands interweaves seamlessly with Hindu bhakti imagery. Radha Krishnalal. And the pivot point is longing, restlessness for the beloved. After the Mongols conquered Baghdad and Iran, Delhi replaced Baghdad as the cosmopolitan Islamic center with a new music idiom pioneered by Amir Khusro. Amir Khusro embraced Gokul, Vrindavan, even Kanhaya in some cases, and a truly transreligious music was formed, unifying two discrete religions. This lasted from 13th century right up to the early part of 20th century and died with the seeds of divisionism nurtured during colonial time. I must highlight some compositions of Gaharjan in this context, which she recorded in the early part of 20th century. One composition is like this: Rasool Khude Bansi Wala Hai Re. It is a clear allusion to Krishna. Then he writes another song, Holi Khelata Khwaja Mainuddin. Mainuddin Chisti is playing Holi in Vrindavan. In later lines, Vrindavan also came up. And most strikingly, Mere Hazrat ne Madine mein manai Holi, meaning that how the Prophet is playing Holi in Medina along with his companions. I shudder to think, really shudder to think what will happen to any such compositions today. But Gaharjan brings us to the last topic in today's discussion, a topic initiated in the beginning by Marco Polo and followed up by Abbe J. A. Du Bois in his reminiscences about courtesans. Most ustads and scholars I had met or read believed that traditional music owed their continuity to the tawaifs, named differently in different ages and contexts, from apsaras to kanchanis to lolonis to baiadeiras in Portuguese and Noch by the Britishers, or most popularly as baijis. It is almost an established fact that Thungri were exclusively composed for them, and most of the scholars believe that the earliest and most famous Khayal composers, Sadarang and Adarang, created this feminine genre mainly for their female followers. It is also a fact that the Tawaifs were given prominent positions in the courts of Akbar and Shah Jahan, and even by the later Mughal rulers, and appear in many important Mughal paintings. In fact, in the paintings, it is the emperor and maybe one of the Kanchanis, which they are called at that time, appearing in the painting. Entire painting, the emperor and the Kanchani, which is actually a Tawaif or Baiji in today's context. Most of their exalted position were reported in writings of the earliest European travelers, like Peter Mundi, who wrote in 1632, Balthazar Solvins, 1810, Francisco Palciat, 1624, and F. Bernier, etc. But there were no complementary evidence given for their excellence in music. One Captain T. Williamson, writing in 1813, admitted that most Englishmen talk about the dazzling jewelries of the notches and really about other things. There were, however, few contemporary Indian observers also, and one Mirza Jafar Hussain gave a wider perspective of Derrida Tawaifs or high-class courtesans. I quote this English translation. They were outstanding artists, Many of them were superb dancers and singers. They possessed inviolable manners, etiquette, and politeness. These courtesans did not normally appear in public. The nobility and the gentry themselves visited them. However, sometimes they went to see friendly nobles on their own or on request. In the noble's darbar, there would be free and unreserved exchange of views, which usually concerned prose, poetry, and humor. The courtesans attended such darbars with her face fully covered. It is very interesting also to note that the nobility and gentry used to send their sons to them to learn culture and etiquette. Whatever scanty biographical details we have about Janki Bai, Husna Jan, or Gahar Jan, uh, these biographical details strongly confirm the views expressed above, and the gramophone records of these great tawais leaves us with no doubt about their music greatness or musical greatness. However, by the end of 19th century, a new elite British educated Indian group started preaching Victorian morals. The core group of reformationists, comprising of doctors, lawyers, and missionaries, impressed upon the upper class intelligentsia that watching Notch was a vice. Interestingly, the Governor General Lord Curzon intervened in favor of the twice, but the movement persisted, with the Theosophical Society of India joining in, and ultimately and effectively, these tribes were hooted out of our culture. The voice of Anand Kumaraswamy was raised again, calling this movement puritanical as snobbery of anglicized Indians and stupidity of educationists. But his voice was drowned by the popular borrowed Swadeshi vortex. And Munir Bai of Lucknow commented that the end of us began with Gandhiji and Arya Samaj. The noted Sadi dancer, now we call it Bharatanatyam, Bala Saraswati, after proper sanitization of the Sadi, which was the earlier version of Bharatanatyam, told Rukmini Devi Arundel of Kalakshetra that the new Bharatanatyam uh, dancers may take over the profession of the sadis, which were practiced by the Devdasis, but they will never be able to take over their art. Thus ended another great tradition. Uh, I'm almost at the end, but before I end, I thought that at my age, I'm entitled to do some moralizing or give some morals. The colonial encounters and some of its direct or indirect effects were sought to be observed by me on our traditional music. One fundamental aspect was guiding the entire process of history of this period. That is the subtle domination of one culture over the other. Since this was unconscious in character, it created a slavery in thought without our realizing. There are two aspects of cultural interlopations. One is by cultural subjection, when one culture is superseded by another culture without competition. The other is by cultural assimilation, which is a very positive intake of another culture after weighing all pros and cons. It is what Kumaraswamy said earlier about the postgraduate. Uh, it was feared that to some extent the Indian mind lapsed, excepting some men of genius. Many ideas and views expressed thereafter could be an expression of a shadow mind of the West. If we are conscious, we may pierce this shadow and arrive at our true minds and start, maybe, examining Western music and Western culture from a purely Indian perspective. So I'm ending here. Namaskar.
Thank you, Jyotirindra Moitra, for this very enlightening and enriching lecture. I would now like to request Debashish Rai Chaudhuri to take over the interactive session and sum up the lecture. There are some observations, um, uh, not many questions yet, but I would like to invite questions from the audience who have been really patient and they have really enjoyed. There are so many comments in the comment section. So, without much ado, I would request Debashish Rai Chaudhuri to take over this session.
Thank you very much, Sri Rontidev Moitro, for this extremely informative and illuminating lecture. It had been a journey through several centuries of Indian culture, starting with the pre-British colonizers and then the time from where we had this Asiatic society, formation of the Asiatic society, Max Muller, and he's writing a preface to the book on Hindu music. And then the writer was not very complimentary about the flute and other wind instrument, but slightly better, slightly he appreciated the Veena instead. Um, so then we have a very, very interesting, I would say, entire um, um, a gamut of the reactions of the colonial um, response to Indian music. Much of it was based on an utter misunderstanding and ignorance of the colonizers. And then uh, Anand Kumaraswamy's thesis, along with Fox Strangers's thesis, who thought that Rabindranath personified Indian music and his music would please even Plato. That was a very interesting comment. And how the recordings, the gramophone record, which could have been a positive, could have left a positive influence on the preservation of Indian music. In certain ways, it was the contrary because it had to, restrict the long, presentations within a very, very short area of a very, very short time frame of 3 minutes, which did not make any kind of, which did not give the proper impression of Indian music. And then he was talking about how the shift of patronage from the darbars to the anglicized middle class had affected the appreciation of music, appreciation of Indian music. These are very important points on which serious researchers can take over from this point and they can work on these points. But what I personally found was Sri Moitro's idea about the trans-religious music, where we had both Hindus and Muslims sensibilities merging in the medium of music, in the court music of India, and his examples from Gauhar Jan's recordings, where we have references of uh, uh, the prophet playing holy. That was really, that could be blasphemous for in today's standards, but it really happened. Those records, those gramophone records, are still there. So. Now, there were very many interesting comments. Shomeshlal Mukherjee, he has requested a reference list to the speaker. Obviously, it be a very rich bibliography that he has referred to. And then Mira Dey had asked a question, that what happened to the folk music? I don't know if the speaker would like to reflect on this, though I don't think his
No,
periphery was folk music today. It
I'll
was
react to
basically
that. Yeah, I'll react
traditional.
to that also. But so
Okay,
this is the first
okay,
question, right?
okay.
Let me
And
listen to
then,
the other question, then I'll try
yeah,
to react one by one. Right.
okay. Questions, there are not many. There is Shupurna Sinha responding to your lecture, saying that the discussions of the trans-religious music was fascinating, and there was Nundita Basu, who also referred to this. Uh, is there any other question that we have received?
Yes, there is another question. Uh, Devolina Guho Thakurta writes, a history conveniently forgotten. How did classical music used in many theaters interacted or countered such colonial marginalization? This is a very interesting question.
Yes.
How did classical music used in many theaters interacted or countered such colonial
Yeah. So
marginalization?
Okay. So first,
I'll
maybe we
start from
can
the
uh,
last.
talk
No,
about
I'll
the
start from the
folk
last,
part.
fresh in my mind. Then I'll go to the folk. Yeah. Now,
Okay. Okay.
insofar as the
Okay.
theaters are concerned, I presume that one is discussing about the theater during the colonial period. Now, mostly in the Maharashtra Marathi theaters, they were all mythological, all mythological. I mean, I hardly know of any theater which is not mythological in character, mythological or historical. There very little scope for this countering this type of sentiments. And in the classic theater or Minerva theater in Kolkata also, if you'll find from the repertoire that mostly they were historical, mythological. Of course, there are some like Neil Dorpon and all those, or satirical of Michael Madhushan, but there the scope of classical music was very less. But there is a but to everything. I think in 1930s, when there are certain plays were produced, and particularly when Nuzrul Islam was required to write songs for those theaters and give tunes, he made full utilization of to give a very slanting views on these Britishers. But again, there are very few. So I don't recollect much classical. First of all, in the Kolkata, the classical culture was not there in theater music, not pronounced. In Maharashtra, it was there, and in Maharashtra, it is mythological, historical. So hardly uh, there are any. I don't recall, much, excepting Nozrul Islam's 4 or 5. That's in 1930s, 34, 35. That's the period. And
And the next question is
about the
on the
folk,
folk music.
the situation is worse. Actually, first of all, the dialects, there are so many sects within sects, sects within sects, and even now, I think that is where it was, first of all, more anthropological. The anthropologists, early anthropologists did something about trying to garner something out of those songs to see how they are relating to their social structure and their genesis, etc. But the British anthropologists, they didn't have the access to the local language, which are so many, varieties are so many that hardly any study has ever been made. In fact, Mr. Fox Strangways also came with a about agenda that he should also study the folk music, but he simply was lost. He just went to some Rajasthan villages, saw some sarindas and everything, and that's about it. Some, and there are hardly any reference to folk songs in music literature. To the best of my knowledge, at least I don't know of any.
Okay.
Unfortunately, unfortunately or
Shupurna,
fortunately, they would have. Yeah. Yes.
Shupurna Sinha has added a question. Could you comment on the Notuswara, which was an interesting merging of the Eastern and the Western tradition? That is a question from Shupurna Sinha.
No, actually, I'm to be very frank, I'm not really, aware of this particular aspect. So I should let it pass, and I really do not know much about this to comment on this. Thank you very
No,
much.
okay.
All the same, I looked this up. It definitely. Thanks, Supuda,
No, to
for
Swara. Okay.
Notuswara.
pointing out something which I must learn now. This is a. I'm writing it down.
So
Thank you very much.
Devolina Guhotakurta has put forward another question. Sir, could you elaborate on Ghazal, which also has an interesting journey?
Ghazal actually, uh, the Persian ghazal, it came from Persia, and as I said, it is always express of love from man to man. You know, it's not never expressed to the female. It's actually homosexual in character. So ghazals. That's why this Europeans found it so difficult to understand. So it is always love expressed for a man to another man. It's very difficult for us to understand the origin, the earlier ghazals. It's very difficult. Now it would appear that the lovers are women. Actually, it's not so. The lovers are always man to man love.
That's a
That's
very,
essence of
very
that.
That's an
interesting revelation.
Yeah, because ghazal, unlike I commented something on Tungri and Khyal and also
Yes.
Qawwalis, that it is all feminine gender, because it was supposed to be sung by the naikas, the female body, erotic female singing that. But in ghazal, it is always the male. It is
Oh,
always the male
Okay.
perspective. That's the basic difference between ghazal and a Tungri. The perspective is Tungri and Khyal is female, ghazal is
While
male.
the ghazal is from the male.
so
Yeah.
how did the colonial rulers react to
Respond
it
to
or
this.
respond to
No,
Ghazal?
no, they were abashed. They were. I think
They were
they
scandalized,
were
maybe?
scandalized. Yes, scandalized. Absolutely. In fact, they were
No, but
scandalized about Radha's love of Krishna. Also, they were scandalized. They
Yeah,
knew. Even now, if you tell them that what is exactly Sringar Rasa, it's very difficult. What is the
right.
difference between divinity and eroticism?
Mm-hmm.
Even for people like us, it's very difficult. If you want
Mm-hmm.
me to
Mm-hmm.
explain, say something for 10 minutes, I might continue up to 3 4 minutes. After that, it will be difficult for me also. It's a
Anindo
difficult.
Narayan
No,
বিশ্বাস.
I might, because I have really, imbibed the rasa of kirtans and tungris, but it's a difficult concept.
Right. So there's another comment from Anindo Narayan বিশ্বাস. contribution of Devdasis in music may be elaborated in a later lecture. It would be very interesting. So yes,
Yes.
that can be. There are so
Luckily,
many aspects which can be elaborated in a
yeah.
later lecture.
Luckily, this there are a lot of recordings available of Devdasis, so
Oh,
that can be played. Lot of
maybe an,
recordings are.
some. I mean, the next session may have some
Yeah,
audio clips.
Devdasis is fantastic. Yeah, Devdasis will be fantastic. A fascinating thing, because the Devdasis, they are wind players. The greatest wind players are all Devdasis. Like for example, Veena Shanmuga Vaidipu or Veena Dhanam. Uh, you'll be surprised that Abdul Karim Khan, got their music training from them.
Mhm.
But that's a
So
different story. I mean, we'll not go
questions
into
Here
it.
is another question. I think
questions are
questions are now
and
pouring in.
observations are pouring in.
Faisal Kadir, he has commented that, however, there are so many romantic ghazals between man and women, as well as so many ghazals on spiritual motivation. Would you like to comment on that?
Spiritual motivation, ghazals and qawwalis, definitely I did comment on that. And again, insofar as man and woman ghazals are concerned, they are definitely later ghazals, not the earliest form of Persian ghazals. No,
I
not
see.
the ghazals of Rumi, not the ghazals of Hafiz, not the earlier ghazals. No, they are all
Okay.
later, today's context. Because today you cannot write like that. No? You might be jailed in
Okay.
Right.
today's circumstances.
Okay,
Mm.
Joyaditya Moitro has asked a question. How the form of Thumri has changed from the time of Wajid Ali Shah?
Actually, the form of Tungri has not changed. What has changed are the Tungri singers. Because during the time of Wajid Ali Shah, the Tungri singers knew what exactly Sringar meant. And they experienced Sringaras in their life, whereas it would be extremely difficult for, other household women to experience exactly what is Sringar. I'll not go further into that. It will become, there could be kids here. But for example, the answer has been given by, I think, Bala Saraswati, who told Rukmini Devi Arundel that you might have taken the profession from us, but not the craft. The craft of Tungri singing has changed because the Sringar has their own pukars, and that pukars come from experience. Should I elaborate further? I should not.
You may talk about the
No, I
word
don't think
pukar,
so.
because
Pardon?
not everybody,
Puk,
The
puk,
word,
puk,
the
the
term
pukar,
term
Pukar.
puk,
pukar.
puk, puk, pukar is ecstasy, expressed ecstasy which comes out of union. Because you see, the
Okay.
essential rasa of Tungra is waiting. It's like, foreplay in love. So
Hmm.
waiting, ultimately coming to the sum, which is where the pukar comes, which is the ultimate ecstasy. This is Tungri, is all about Tungri. So it's
Mhm.
very erotic in nature.
Right.
Right.
There's a
There is a comment by Tista Bagchi. There is a record on
Iron Jack in the
I Am
Guardian.
Jack in the Guardian of Max Muller and Dwarkanath Tagore meeting in Paris in 1844 and discussing Indian music. Max Muller found Indian music still strange even after hearing Dwarkanath perform a sample or two. This is somewhat one off as an East West encounter focusing on music, perhaps. So she is
Yes,
actually supporting your point that
yes,
uh,
it is true. And not only that, there had been instances where Indian musicians had gone to Paris and London in 1890s, early part of 20th century also. Asadullah Kutub Khan went there. One great tabla player also went there. So what happened that they only looked at their fingers, how they're moving their fingers. They couldn't understand anything of the graces of our music. It is just about the dexterity of the tabla player. They thought that there is some electric battery fitted to the fingers, and it became, some sort of circus activity. Nothing to do with music. So it is how
Right.
they, but they went because at that time also there were some sponsors, some Rajas or Maharajas sponsored them. In fact, some Rajas and Maharajas, when they are going to England, they carried their own musicians for their pleasure. They are really music lovers, and 6 months stay in Paris or Monte Carlo, they cannot be deprived of music, so they took some musicians.
Uh, may I just intervene? This is a very interesting uh, observation that you just made, that they only looked at the fingers and they thought that there is some kind of a battery or
Battery fitted,
electric,
yeah,
something
electric,
has
yeah.
been fitted. So, do you think this is the post-industrial revolution Europe looking at things? I mean, it's so mechanized, so machine oriented, and like mechanical. Do you think it's one of the reasons that they have gone through the industrial revolution by that
Yeah, so
time? And
yes, yes, that is exactly what Anand Kumaraswamy has meant. Exactly that is what he has meant. Because I
right,
just quoted some portions of Anand Kumaraswamy. He has written,
right,
reams
right.
and reams on this. This is exactly, thank you. This is exactly what Anand Kumaraswamy meant. Yes.
Okay, so Devolina Ghotakutta is also asking, what about Tappa?
Tappa, James Todd's view or my view? Whose view? J-
Your
J-
view in this case,
the-
your view
the-
on James Todd's view, maybe.
Yes.
it is possible that but at that time it was strongly connected with opium, because a lot of musicians did take opium. Even in my
Mhm.
lifetime I've seen older musicians take to opium, but opium cannot be the only attribute to a good tappa. So this Punjabi takka, which this Shorimia tappa, of course, this Punjabi tappa, it has hardly any meaning, just one or two words, for effects. And this Shorimia tappa, uh, of course, became very popular in the north. And it also came to Calcutta, courtesy this Ramjan Khan. So, and one aspect I must say that Rabindranath always adapted Shorimiya's Tappa and not Nidhu Babu's Tappa, because Nidhu Babu's Tappa, his Bengali Tappa is totally different, because in Bengali Tappa the literature is very important, because it's a first love literature, modern love literature of India in terms of music is Nidhu Babu's Tappa, and it's very modern in concept of this as a literature. Excellent. But Nidhu Babu's Tappa style is totally different. The is slow, medium, and the tans were more rounded off. But Shorimiya's Tappa is brisk, is fast. It's absolutely just an effect. Again, it's a musical effect that's that helter skelter speed. That marks Shorimiya's Tappa. It requires a lot of voice flexibility, dexterity, and whatnot. So I don't have any other views on Tappa, but again, Tappa is a dying art, no doubt about it. Hardly any good Tappa singers today. Same in case of Nidhu Babu's Tappa or in the case of Shorimiya's Tappa. I don't think uh, there are good teachers also, and some of them Gwalior singers, they are on the way out.
I think we
Otherwise, I
can
don't
take
have any
only.
specific.
I think we can take another question only. This is by Jyotirindra Moitra. He says, any colonial influence on some specific gharanas of Drupad and Khayal? Any colonial
Gharanas
influence?
no, the Gharanas didn't exist at that point of time. I said that because Gharana is a sort of a post-colonial, offshoot. Because the word Gharana didn't exist at that point of time. I mentioned that it's a social anthropological phenomena when the musicians were clustering together to protect themselves after the collapse of the darbars. So, the family clustered themselves, formed a cartel, a power strength, so that they can push their own people. because they were all on their own. It's a post Darbar phenomena. There were the concept of the gharana was not there. Even the name gharana, it never appeared. I don't know where from that name gharana has come from which date. It must be late 1930s or 40s or even 50s. I don't know. I have not found out because I've tried to find out. I've asked a lot of people. They don't know from when this concept has come. It's a very late concept, not during the colonial time. Maybe the late.
Yes. There is Moshumi Bhomik asking you a question. Will you please say something about Inayat Khan? Because I guess that there was a kind of Western encounter with Indian music in that. So Inayat
Yes,
Khan,
Mostly, it's great to have you in the audience.
yeah, thank you, Moshumi
yes,
Bhomik,
yes.
for joining
Yeah, yeah.
us.
Inayat Khan Pathan. You meant Inayat Khan. There are so many Inayat Khans. Actually, one Inayat Khan is from Rampur, and I think you are meaning Inayat Khan Pathan, the Sufi singer, the Sufi philosopher, and who migrated to London and Paris. Yes, uh, there is. He wrote extensively on Indian music, which was translated in Great Britain and some other languages, I'm told. But I've heard that he has performed even on Bean. He was also playing Bean. He was also a vocalist. But I have not seen any specific report of his performing in any part of Europe. I'm very curious to know that. Although he did perform extensively in Calcutta. In fact, the very famous song composed by Rabindranath, "Tumi Kemon Kore Gan Koro He Guni," is dedicated to this Inayat Khan Pathan.
Oh,
He was from he was from Baroda, and he once performed in this Sir Gurudas Bandyopadhyay. I think he convened a music program where Inayat Khan Pathan sang. Rabindranath was in audience, and it is said that Rabindranath was so impressed with Inayat Khan Pathan's music that he composed that song, কেমন করে গান করো হে গুণী আমি অবাক হয়ে শুনি. Uh,
This is a great
and
uh,
so
revelation.
we
Yeah.
too were mesmerized. We were অবাক হয়ে শুনছিলাম uh, by your speech. So now I think I should acknowledge uh, whoever was responsible for this evening. First of all, the speaker, Sri Runtidev Moitra, who has, in a very short time, studied and prepared this extremely informative and rich speech. And then I must thank Sri Ashish Bhodro, who had helped the speaker with his technical support. I must acknowledge Srimati Shushmita Raichaudhuri for her welcome address. I must also acknowledge my daughter Rohini for anchoring this evening. And of course, all the audience, those of you who had participated and made this evening so memorable, so interesting. So we shall now end this session with a song by Jyotirindra Moitra, probably his most famous song. We shall end this session with
এ তো
that.
হয়ে
Esho Mukto Karo. So those of you, usually we sing this in chorus when we have this show on stage, but today it's different. You are with us virtually, so I would request all of you to join us uh, singing this song. Um, Yushmita, if you can please come and join us. Let me hold this.
এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো
অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো শিল্পী, এসো বিশ্বকর্মা, এসো স্রষ্টা। এসো শিল্পী, এসো বিশ্বকর্মা, এসো স্রষ্টা। রসরূপ মন্ত্র দ্রষ্টা। ছিন্ন করো, ছিন্ন করো বন্ধনের এই অন্ধকার। ছিন্ন করো, ছিন্ন করো বন্ধনের এই অন্ধকার। এসো মুক্ত করো, মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো, মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। দিকে দিকে ভেঙেছে যে শৃঙ্খল, দুর্গত দলিতেরা পায় বল। দিকে দিকে ভেঙেছে যে শৃঙ্খল, দুর্গত দলিতেরা পায় বল। এ শুভ লগ্নে তাই তোমার শরণ করি রূপকার। এ শুভ লগ্নে তাই তোমার শরণ করি রূপকার। এসো মুক্ত করো হে দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো, মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো, মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। উঠেছে যে জীবনের লক্ষ্মী, মৃত্যু সাগর মন্থনে। উঠেছে যে জীবনের লক্ষ্মী, মৃত্যু সাগর মন্থনে। নূতন পৃথিবী চায় শিল্পীর ভরা ভাই, নব সৃষ্টির শুভ ফলে। নূতন পৃথিবী চায় শিল্পীর ভরা ভাই, নব সৃষ্টির শুভ ফলে। এসো শ্রমিকের সামনে ঐক্যে, এসো জনতার মুখরিত শক্তি। এসো শ্রমিকের সামনে ঐক্যে, এসো জনতার মুখরিত শক্তি। এসো দুঃখ তিমির ভেদি দুর্গম ধ্বংসের নিষ্ঠুর ভয় করে চূর্ণ। এসো দুঃখ তিমির ভেদি দুর্গম ধ্বংসের নিষ্ঠুর ভয় করে চূর্ণ। এসো প্রাণের ভবন করো পূর্ণ। এসো মুক্ত করো, মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো, মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো, মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার।
Good evening and good afternoon
And good day,
good day
to viewers
to
from
viewers from all over the world.
We end the session.
Hope you enjoyed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.